Welcome everybody to another episode of vBrownBag. Tonight we're going to have Charles Adams at Whitehead Techs talking about vendor-neutral backup design considerations for virtual infrastructures. Some things that we're going to get out of the way before we start. You can always get in on the conversation by tagging our accounts. We have accounts all over the world in Spanish, mostly English for European, but we sometimes do some things in other languages for Europe, Portuguese. Bless you.
Excuse me.
And you can also send things out to the hashtag vBrownBag in Twitter, and I will be monitoring Twitter as well as monitoring any questions that come through the GoToMeeting interface. Again, our guest is right there and looking really spiffy in his suit. And your host is Ariel Sanchez at Ariel Sanchez More. You can just tweet at me directly as well if you need anything. Charles, I'm going to change presenter and send it over to you. And take it away.
All right, thank you, Ariel. All right, so the topic for tonight is going to be the vendor-neutral backup design considerations for virtual infrastructures. This is basically going to be a crash course on dealing with how your backups are going to occur in a virtual environment. So a little bit about myself. I've been a backup admin for a little over 10 years. I do have some experience with VMware with both my VCP certifications as well as being recognized as a vExpert the last 2 years. Thank you very much. And my primary experience has been with both the NetBackup and Commvault software. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me at my Twitter account, my email address, or you can follow along on my website where I post articles at various times about different situations with things I run into. So the real objective of the presentation is going to be not so much to tell you how you're going to set up your backups in your virtual infrastructure. It's going to be more of like how to work with your backup admin so that you get the most out of your backups and make sure that everything runs smoothly. They do tend to be the most overlooked function in your environment when designing and tend to have a very large impact on your environment whenever they actually do run. So unfortunately, it's one of those things that if it's not planned for in advance, it comes back to bite you, and you get a nasty surprise later on when everything starts dragging really slowly. So obviously enough is when you should either consider your design or reconsider your design. If you have a chance to greenfield a new deployment. If you're dealing with multiple products, either virtual infrastructure products such as VMware and or Hyper-V or Acropolis, or if you are doing a hardware refresh, as far as multiple products, also if you're dealing with multiple backup solutions in your environment. And then also you need to make sure that you reconsider your design if your business requirements change, such as any kind of hours of operations, backup windows, your recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, etc. So just to go ahead and get some terminology out of the way so that everybody's talking the same language. Everybody's heard VMware APIs for data protection, VADP. I realize that there's the whole VDDK API suite, but your backup admin is typically going to check by VADP, and that's going to be all he's going to know. He's not going to know the whole API stack and wanting to discuss each part of it. So the VADP is just a catch-all. Also, change block tracking. If you're not using it right now, please turn it on. It's going to save you a lot of headache when it comes to your backups, making sure that you're only backing up incremental blocks so that your backup windows or your backups shrink considerably. And, of course, deduplication. And then the support and impact of that's going to vary based on what products you're using, what backup solutions you're using, and how you're actually performing those backups. So getting into it, we're talking about let's discuss physical versus virtual backup devices or backup targets. So this would be either your server that's running your backup solution, your appliance that's running it, or a virtual machine that's running it. So, of course, physical devices, it's going to be less processing, memory, and storage load on your virtual infrastructure. Typically is going to support more transport methods, and what it will support will vary by your vendor. It is going to be tied to hardware, so you're going to have a dedicated device sitting out there somewhere that's going to be only handling your backup system. And then typically hot add as a transport method is only going to be supported by a proxy agent. So you will still have to have a device or a virtual machine out there to act as your proxy. Your virtual appliances, those can be deployed remotely and more easily decentralized, since it's just a virtual machine that gets copied around just like any other. You're not going to have as much hardware to worry about, simply because it's going to be using your ESXi hosts. The only real concerns will be your memory and processor utilization primarily. Now, this one typically does not support SAN backup. It is possible for there to be exceptions. It's going to vary by your backup vendor as to what they will and won't support. But as a general rule of thumb, if you're going to use a virtual device or virtual appliance, expect to not be able to use your SAN backup methodology. And this is going to obviously increase your workload on your ESXi hosts. So currently, the VADP or VMware APIs support 4 different transport methods. There's going to be SAN, Nbd, Mbd Ssl, and hot add. Now, some vendors will call them different stuff. I've seen some that refer to hot add as appliance backups, things like that. But these are the basic transport modes as defined in the APIs, which I've went ahead and attached a link to both guides for the APIs for vSphere 6.5 and 6.7. So talking about these 4 modes, SAN transport. It's going to require block storage access, either fiber channel over Ethernet, or iSCSI. Some of the pros to it is it's typically a faster backup. Data flows directly from your storage system, so you're not having to pass through an ESXi host for getting access to the VMDKs. You do not need to have VM kernel access, which in some environments is that may be restricted for security purposes or compliance. And it's going to reduce your overall IP traffic use in your environment. Now, some of the cons. Typically, SAN transport tends to be slower on restores, especially on the provision disks, and this is a limitation of the VDDK APIs. It can increase your infrastructure costs because you're going to have to be implementing either iSCSI, additional iSCSI connections, fiber channel connections, all the various different functions to expand to support that access to the block storage. Again, some vendors support it, some vendors will not. It will only provide you access to SAN-based data stores, with the exception of vVols. vVols are not supported by SAN transport. And it also, you're not going to have access to vSAN, NFS data stores, and your encrypted VMs, if you're running those in your environment, cannot be backed up over SAN transport. And in some of the earlier versions of vSphere, if you try to run a restore of a virtual machine and the disk size is not a multiple of the underlying VMFS block size, then it can actually cause a restore to fail. So next, we're going to talk about the Nbd Transport, which is short for Network Block Device. This does require your VM kernel port access. So Generally, it does reduce the overall cost because you're just transporting over what you already have currently. It tends to be one of the most widest and broadest supported transport methods of any of the four. They typically do have faster restores, especially if you're dealing with in-provision disks. And it does support vVols, NFS, SAN, and vSAN data stores. Now, some of the cons to it are that your VM kernel port is actually throttled for Nbd traffic or NFC traffic by VMware. This is actually hard-coded in there. As more connections come in, it actually reduces the available bandwidth to the port, or I should say to each of the individual channels, and therefore it's going to throttle you. It can be less reliable due to network interruptions. If something happens where you end up overloading your switch for whatever reason, like in a remote office, or if you do run into any kind of network-related issues, firewalls, anything else, it can cause your connections to break, and then your backups can fail. It is typically slower than your SAN transport because it is over an IP traffic. And you still do not get encrypted VM backup support. So if you're using VMware's virtual machine encryption, you're not going to be able to back it up using Mbd. So now we get to Mbd Ssl Transport, which is network block device over SSL. Just like Nbd, it requires VM kernel port access. It has all the same benefits as your network block device transport, but it also enhances security by using SSL encryption for the transport. It still supports your vVols, NFS, SAN, and vSAN data stores, but this actually does have support for encrypted VMs as well. Now, the cons are typically the same as your Mbd as far as the network faulty. If you have a network drop, you're going to have the same basic issues, and it is typically slower, and you do get the throttled traffic as well.
So, Charles, we do have, this has sparked several questions, mostly about the bandwidth. So, is there an advanced config to change the bandwidth restrictions? Can you leverage multiple VM hosts? Which I think that's a yes. I'm being asked, is the backup implementation specific, or is it the same for every vendor? And could you talk more about this bandwidth limitation? I don't know if you have an upcoming slide.
No, I don't actually. It's documented in the APIs. I used to have a nice article that described the actual limitations. So first off, the bandwidth, the throttling is actually hard-coded into the BDDK APIs. It is not something that is configurable. You can't put in a touch file and adjust it. It is what it is, and you're stuck with it. And I believe it's actually hard-coded, so even if you were to say have 3 or 4 10 gig VM kernel ports aggregated together, I don't believe it'll actually utilize it because I believe it's actually hard-coded to a certain maximum size of transport, and so therefore it ends up aggregating the links really doesn't buy you much after that point. This is a VDDK or a VADP function, so this is something that is universal across all of your backup vendors. It is a limitation implemented by VMware themselves.
Yep, and I do remember that if you have several hosts, each host can have a stream. I remember that we had talked. I also remember that document that you're referring to. It was about you'll never exceed, I think it was around 80% of the bandwidth of a link, and you will not have several streams per host. You will have one stream per host. So I remember it's very specific as to how it can limit the bandwidth.
Well, as of 6.5, the VM kernel port is up to 25 NFC connections. So 25 disks being backed up at any given time. NFC is your network file copy function within the VMware APIs, which is what Nbd actually uses for the copying. Mm-hmm. So they've actually upped it to 25 simultaneous streams that can be transferred from any VM kernel port. Now, unfortunately, I put in a feature request a while back to be able to check a box for a VM kernel port to say that I want this port dedicated for backups only, and to be able to remove that that bandwidth cap. But I've not heard of any kind of changes being made in that fashion. Now, to your point, yes, you can actually, depending on your backup software and how you have it implemented, you can actually set a limitation so that you can only back up so many virtual machines from a particular host at the same time, and therefore you're actually distributing your backup workload across more of your ESXi hosts. Therefore, you're increasing your overall throughput. So that is a possibility. Did I cover pretty much all the questions, or did I miss anything in there?
I think we're good. I'm going to try to find that link. Thank you.
Okay. So the last transport method is actually going to be your hot add transport. This will require a guest VM proxy running in your ESXi environment. So it's going to use your VM snapshotting functionality and link clones and mount those actual snapshots to your proxy host to copy out. It can reduce your overall backup size over the LAN by performing client-side dedupe. It can you can set up multiple proxies to allow for increased throughput of your environment, and this does support vVols, NFS, SAN, vSAN data stores. And I didn't mark it there, but it does support encrypted virtual machines as well. But there are some pretty strict limitations on that. Some of the cons are going to be your client-side dedupe. It's going to definitely increase your CPU utilization on your host, because your proxy is actually the one that's going to be handling the deduplication. So it's going to be having to hash out everything and actually go back and do the actual dedupe itself. So your proxies are typically going to be either you're going to have a Windows proxy that's going to function for Windows backups, and Linux proxies that function for Linux backups. But they actually they basically will only support their own platform. So if you have both the systems in your environment, at least the last time I checked, you will need to have a proxy for each platform that you have. So that means that if you do have a mixed environment, you're automatically going to have a minimum of 2 proxies. It's going to use your regular network for transport. So if you have, you can either carve out a VLAN for your proxy to go on across the backup to isolate it from your production clients or your regular client VM traffic. Or it's going to end up utilizing the same bandwidth as your client VMs. So the proxy must reside on a data store using the same block size as the intended backup client. That was some of the details I was reading in the release notes with the for VDDK as well. And each proxy is going to be limited to a maximum of 60 concurrent VMDK backups per proxy. So it can mount up a maximum of 60 disks at any given time, and this is because the virtual machines only support up to 4 SCSI controllers with 15 disks per controller. So if you have a very tight backup window and a lot of clients, then you're probably going to end up having to implement additional proxies to support that. Also, not mentioned here is if you have any kind of proxies that excuse me, if you have any kind of clusters that have data stores that are restricted, so that you're going to have a proxy for any kind of isolated data stores, anything like that. That you're not going to be able to. It has to be able to mount up the snapshot on whatever host it's on. So going forward, we also have talking a little bit about agent versus agentless backups. So agent-based backups are your traditional backup methodology. You're going to load an application into your virtual machine. You're going to treat it as if it's a physical host, and it's going to back up like normal. It'll back up over the same interfaces, network interfaces that your virtual machine currently uses. And this is probably going to be one of the most impactful methods that you could use in order to back up your virtual infrastructure. Agentless backups or agentless VMware backups do not require you to load any kind of applications or proxies into the virtual machine itself to perform those guest backups. So I probably shouldn't have said proxies there, just because what it amounts to is you're not going to have a software running in those virtual machines in order to back up. They're going to use the VADP APIs to and one of those 4 transport methods to actually back up. So that's the main difference there between the agent and agentless backups. Now you also have application aware backups. You can kind of think of these as agent light. A lot of times they do, so they're going to be backing up the virtual machine using the VADP methods, but they do typically still require some sort of guest application to be installed for communication, like to tell the application it's going to quiesce and that it is actually being backed up, so that the application is aware. As far as the support, it's going to vary based by product. Typically, when someone talks about application-aware backups, currently they're referring to either Microsoft Exchange, Microsoft SQL, or Microsoft SharePoint. Those are the 3 common products that are supported for application-aware backups currently. So getting into selection criteria. Your backup solution, depending on which one you have, is going to have all kinds of different ways that you can select virtual machines for dynamic queries or decide which machine, or statically set up which machine you're going to use. And some products support some features and others will not. So selection criteria can be your virtual machine display name, the host name, DNS name, the BIOS UUID, or the instance UUID. Some of these, like for example, the host name and DNS name actually require the VMware tools to be running. So if you have an environment that you turn on a machine to make a change and then you turn it off again and you leave it off, but you still want that backed up, then that means that you cannot use a host name or DNS name, because the VMware tools will not be running, and therefore you will not be able to actually back that machine up. Other things that you can use for your selection criteria could be a users and computers folders. You can use VMware tags. You could use your host, cluster, data center, or vCenter level selection. What data store? You can use your power state. So if the machine is powered on, I'm only worried about machines that are running. So if a machine gets powered off, it gets skipped for the backups. And again, there's other criteria that they could be selected, and I could just keep going on with those details. The part that you need to be careful of is that if you use a generic term for selection criteria, so if you say create a folder in each of your data centers called backups, and you decide that your query is going to be based on backups, and if that's the only thing you use for selection, then there's a chance that you could actually end up backing up a virtual machine across your WAN if your backup application is able to connect to those devices. So that you do need to make sure that when you use queries, you make sure that you keep in mind that that your query is only selecting virtual machines that are in an intended location. So large companies or companies that tend to acquire other companies may end up running into having multiple solutions in their environments. Now, it's easy to actually implement multiple backup solutions in an environment as long as you take into consideration the limitations of each product, and you go ahead and account for those. So, you do need to work with your backup admin and or your backup vendor to find what selection criteria works for all your products. We actually ran into this with our company when Ariel and I were implementing this. We found that certain feature sets, such as tags, were supported with one product, one version, but not with a different version. And another product wouldn't support it at all. So we had to find a common ground to use for our selection criteria. And you need to determine that if you use multiple backup solutions, are you going to separate it by a region, by data center, cluster? Or is it going to be a workload type? And so you'll need to sit down and design or draw up some rules about what product is going to be used for what purpose. Now, your granularity. Your backups, typically you can support excluding disks. So if you have servers that have a very large secondary disk that's used for only swap file, and then everything else is important, you could exclude only that second disk. Some products will even allow you to exclude folders or files of the virtual machine itself. Then when we get into restores, you can actually choose to restore an entire virtual machine, a particular disk, a folder, or a file. Now, some of these restores may require an agent to be loaded in order to run that restore. Not all of them support restoring directly a file directly back into the same virtual machine without any kind of additional help. Some products can also perform instant recovery, where an NFS share is mounted from your backup solution into your virtual environment, and then the virtual machine is actually powered on. It is actually connected to and powered on from your backup device, so that you can get that machine online immediately, and then you can do a storage vMotion and to copy the data back out to your production environment. I've heard some companies that recommend this for single file restores, which to me it seems like it's a little bit wasteful. The idea of a urgent use to mount it back up and then move it out seems like a much more usable function of this. And again, not all products support it, so you'll have to find out what, based on your products, what does and does not is not a feature of your product. So some common gotchas. Some products will actually allow you to skip the swap files, which on Windows is fine. It'll and I'm referring to the guest OS swap file, not your VM swap file. So your swap file inside of Windows or your swap partition in Linux. Now, if you do exclude your swap files on a Linux virtual machine guest, if you do perform a full system recovery, that Linux or that swap partition will actually not be recreated. So when it goes to boot up from a full Linux VM recovery, you will need to go back and recreate the swap partition so that the machine runs properly. Now, some backup or some file systems are actually do not support granular recovery, and that's actually a limitation of the VDDK. So, for example, ext4 was not supported in some of the earlier versions of the VDDK for single file recovery. That has been added, but newer file systems like BRTFS still remain unsupported. So you can still back up the virtual machine. You can restore the whole virtual machine. You can restore a disk, but you wouldn't be able to crack it open and pull out a single file. Now, something that one of my friends ran into was quiescing. So he had a pair of SQL servers in a cluster with basically mirrored copies of the cluster. And what would happen is whenever he would go to run a backup, it would quiesce the cluster, his active SQL cluster actually kept failing over back and forth repeatedly during his backup window. So that is something to keep in mind. He had to actually change his method that he was backing up those machines with. And then some products will actually allow you to install a plugin into vCenter so that you can view the status of backups or to actually perform some sort of management and or recovery from directly within vCenter. The solution that I had experience with, I went to go and deploy it. The plugin looked like it loaded. It showed that in the API browser that it loaded. It wasn't loading into vCenter. Well, come to find out, the binary files that it needed to copy, I had hosted off of a HTTP web server, and vCenter will only allow you to import from a secure HTTPS server. It does not trust an unencrypted session for loading a plugin. So that wasn't really well documented anywhere, and so that's something that you may run into if you go to deploy a plugin and you see it's there, but it doesn't, or it looks like it's there, but you don't actually have it ever show up. That may be something that you could be running into.
And Charles, just to stop you there a little bit, I think you had made a blog post about that kind of thing, right?
I did.
A particular vendor that had a certain situation.
Exactly. It was, and
I'll send out the link to the blog post. I'll look it up.
Sure. Yeah, and so it was documented on page, like, I think it was 56 of 59 of the plugin book. So, and it was only like a 2-line blurb in there. So it was not an easy problem to find. All right. And then getting into permissions. Now, this is every admin's nightmare. So your agent-based backups that we were talking about before aren't going to require any kind of vCenter permissions. They work in the guest level, and so you see nothing about them, and so it doesn't matter to you. Now, your agentless backups, so your VADP backups, are going to require a user account to establish those connections and to perform these functions. Each backup solution is going to have their own set of rules as far as what sets of permissions they're going to need. But realistically, there are only a couple of checkboxes short of your admin account. It's not going to need access to security, but it's going to need almost everything else because it will need to be able to not only back up, snapshot, but it'll also need to be able to create and establish connections. So be aware that that backup user account is going to be almost an admin by the time you're done with it. Now, getting into if you're dealing with multiple backup solutions within your environment, do you want to use a single backup user account for all your products, or do you want to have multiple accounts? This was actually something that Ariel and I had debated about whenever we were setting it up. And so a single user account is going to be easier to do, and you just unfortunately you will end up providing it with the permissions that all the products need combined. But then all your solutions are going to use the same one, so you're not going to know if something happens which product it came from. Multiple accounts will allow you to identify which particular product is performing something that could be detrimental to your environment, and allows you to isolate it. It also, if something happens to that account, then it's only going to affect that one product, and your other products will continue to operate normally. But that does mean that you're going to have to set up additional accounts and have each one of them have their own set of permissions within your vCenter environment. And so now we get to the question and answer time. If you're interested, there's some additional reading on using change block tracking. There's a designing backup solutions for VMware's vSphere document that comes directly from VMware. Some additional information on disk transport methods and some best practices in troubleshooting from both Veritas and from VMware themselves. So
I have observations and I have questions.
Okay, sure.
So the first observation is that nowhere in your presentation was there any talk about testing your backups.
Yeah, unfortunately, testing will get into dealing with a particular solution, saying when you go to backup and then go to restore, each one of them you're gonna have to go about it slightly differently. The APIs themselves function the same. So, but I didn't get into covering those. That's something I can add later on as well. So,
yep. It's one of those things that if you're a new VMware admin and suddenly you're also the backup admin because no one else is doing it, it's probably a great idea to include some slides on it. So I thought that was a good observation.
Sure.
We got a question, and we got this question a while ago. You might need to go back on your slides, but
Sure.
It was, can he explain a bit more about client-side dedupe and does it handle CBT?
So
this was around the transport modes when you were talking about just before you started the rest of the presentation.
You're referring to probably the whenever I was talking about hot add.
I believe so. Yeah.
So client-side dedupe is where your backup software running in your proxy agent or your proxy appliance. It's actually handling performing the dedupe on that particular inside of that particular virtual machine instead of offloading that process to a dedicated backup appliance outside of your environment. Now, the drawback to client-side dedupe is that it tends to be very much CPU intensive. So if you use a bunch of small ESXi hosts versus a few large hosts, you're more likely to have a particular ESXi host pegging out on a couple of CPUs versus something that is not doing dedupe in there. Do you have anything else that you want to know about that in particular?
I'm asking if he has a microphone so we can do it, but I will open the floor and say if anybody else wants to ask something, you can raise your hand, you can write it in the interface, or you can let me know and I'll open the microphone. So what kind of questions? One thing that I mentioned when I sent out the tweet is that you have given this presentation in 2 or 3 user cons?
Three different user cons, yes.
What kind of question have you gotten there that you thought was a good question? Maybe something you included there, but someone asked me this or presented a case that you thought it's maybe worth sharing for the recording.
Well, unfortunately, when I give this presentation at UserCons, I haven't gotten a whole lot of questions asked back to me. One of the few questions I did get was surrounding one of the products, NetBackup, and I had a user that asked me about resource limitations. For example, in NetBackup, there's a function that you can restrict the number of any number of attributes. So you could say that you only want so many backups from a certain VMFS data store. You can say you only want so many backups from a particular host. You can there are a bunch of different functions or items that you can use to kind of tailor that out so that, as we were discussing before, like with Mbd, so that you spread the workload across more of your hosts and thereby reduce overloading any particular machine. So that was one of the few questions that I did get was someone asking about implementing resource limitations.
Okay. And finally, the one thing that I was discussing here in the question interface was some people actually have audits, over testing the restores. Have you
Mm-hmm.
found yourself preferring any particular product or finding that the functionality is there or isn't there when you actually have to prove or detail reports on backups?
So, as far as product goes, each product's got their own pros and cons. I mean, unfortunately, it's really hard to give a yes, this one works great, whereas this one's not quite as good. I like Net Backup for the virtual machine queries because they give you so many different objects that you can use for your dynamic selection. Commvault comes in behind it, a little bit less. I found out at the Orlando UserCon when I was there, I was talking to Veeam, and they said, and they were telling me how they implemented tag support for VM selection. And when I started asking about it, they said, "Oh, well, we can either do tag selection or we can do a Boolean query. We can't do both." So if you said, "I want to do a tag for backups," then you would need to make sure that each tag or each location has backups, has a unique tag for it, so that you're only backing up from the intended location. Whereas with NetBackup, I could say, I want this backup tag, but I only want it to come from this data center. So that's from a backup admin's perspective, that seems like that was a very important feature.
Okay. And
now
we're getting more. I'm sorry. I thought you were finished.
I was looking in the chat, and I saw someone had asked about periodic restores. Now, there are some. I think Commvault, I believe, has the ability to schedule restores. NetBackup with the 812 actually provides access to the REST APIs. They implement REST APIs in there, so you could actually, in theory, code out a script or that would sit there and take one of your backups, and then then go back and restore it, and then run a check on it, see if the VM kernel, see if the VM tools comes back online, things like that. So some of your products that do support this, I think that Rubrik supports the REST APIs. So those would be a way that you could automate the process of running a restore and test function without having to go back and manually do this constantly.
Very cool. All right, so we got in more questions. Okay, so any recommendations for checking CBT settings on your VMs without going to Edit Settings, Options, Advanced General Configuration Parameters for each VM? And I'm pretty sure you're going to say PowerShell, but anything else?
Some management tools may support that functionality, but yeah, PowerCLI would probably be your best way to script that out and automate that process. That's the easiest way I would be able to think about it. And I'm not even a coder, and I would make the effort to use that method instead.
Okay. On this particular slide, would one proxy per VM host be a good idea? Pinning basically that VM to the host and keeping one VM per host. Obviously, it comes at a cost, but
well, I wouldn't say that it comes at a cost, because most solutions are going to end up they're either going to license it based on the number of hosts that you've got involved, or the number, and that by hosts I'm referring to your ESXi hosts, or they're going to license it based on the capacity involved. So it's not going to make much of a difference cost wise, except for any kind of licenses for the operating system. But there's not a clear answer for that. It depends on your environment. If you were using a bunch of smaller ESXi hosts, I would not use one proxy per host, just because I don't think that you're going to get enough of a benefit from it to make it worthwhile. Whereas if you're using a few larger hosts, some of these insane ESXi hosts that have a terabyte of RAM in the host itself, that might make more sense to do that, and that way you are more utilizing the resources of your ESXi host a little bit better.
All right. So that's the questions. We are looking forward to that blog post that you have promised with Power CLI to check the CBT settings. And that's going to be it for today. Thank you so much, Charles. We really appreciate your time sharing this so it can be recorded so more people can see it. And it should be up in YouTube in the next 2 days.
All right. Thank you very much.